This is an extremely auspicious moment for me, personally speaking, because I speak to you as someone that was here about 20 years ago. Now, before I came here, I did not know anything about Pondicherry except that I was born in Chennai. And growing up, the two things you did to look and feel cool was one, drive to Pondicherry, and the other is drive to Bangalore. And then, when I grew older, I came across this extraordinary soul, Dr. Asta Patel, who I was going to Tirupati with her, and she and I sat together on a bus. And she taught me no things happen in life by chance. They are all destined and designed by your own destiny. It means if you're destined to meet, you meet. And she was the one who brought me to this extraordinary, bold experiment of Auroville that I've come to love. I literally have been here the amount of times you can count on one hand. So I haven't been here many times. I've been here 4 actually times to be precise today. And only 3 times of those have I been to Auroville. I thank you all for being here. I was supposed to deeply integrate into this community. But what happened was I lost a loved one in 2006, right after having given the grace of Meera Auntie's tour of Auroville and the magic and the miracles that exist here. And when I lost him, destiny had other plans, so I went back to America to find myself. And I ended up at the California Institute for Integral Studies, which of course is inspired by Sri Aurobindo himself. And I studied integral counseling psychology as a palliative care psychotherapist. And I worked with the deaf and dying at the time to understand why my doctor had done what he did. I didn't find too many answers, but I definitely found a journey that was worth every life and every breath. So here I am before you, and I wish I had more time, but I'm going to save that for another time to speak to you about that. But I just want to share with you, David Roberts, who's a truly dear friend of mine. He is distinguished faculty at Singularity University, and he's also, that's just the first thing I know about him because I went to Singularity University in 2014. I was part of the GSP class, which he can speak to a little bit more. And during that time, he, along with the GSP class, activated in me this idea of a massive transformational purpose and gave me the courage to move on from just bringing TED to the United Nations and curating these extraordinary experiences to doing something that not only belonged to me, but I believed in, something that was true to myself. And that was when I truly started to live with purpose and deep meaning. Now, I don't want to say too much about what he's going to speak to you about because that's what you're here for. But I can leave you with this, that David Roberts, in addition to his decorated background of being from Harvard and MIT, which are just the beginning, like literally the formative steps of his life, he's lived a truly extraordinary life and transformed so many lives like my own to really step into our power and humbly our power. I want to be humble about what power means over here. And, make the impossible possible. So with that, without further ado, because I know you're all waiting for this, I'm going to invite David Roberts on stage to share with you what I believe is truly an extraordinary message. Welcome everyone, thank you for being here. We will come back and do a fireside chat. This is my dearest friend and ally and mentor, David Roberts.
It's totally my honor to be here with you. I've heard wonderful things about Auroville. And can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Is there enough sound? Is this on? Yes. I have a lot to cover with you today. I think we've got an hour 15, and then hopefully we have some time at the end for some Q&A. It's been a blessing for me to go through life with people like Kunal, because he has spent his life just doing great things. In fact, the events that I've had the pleasure of attending at the UN that Kunal has put on were not paid for by the UN. Kunal paid for them. And he didn't charge attendance or anything else. And I've always been advising him that I think he should start charging. But it's out of his heart, out of his compassion and love for the world. And I've seen that change with leaders. And the talk that I'll give you today is really about three things: technology, leadership, a little bit, and the potential for human impact. So, if you were to come to Silicon Valley, where Singularity University was formed, and it was formed with only one purpose in mind, which was a place where people could learn how to solve the biggest problems in the world, which meant anything that more than 1 billion people in the world were suffering from. This was before the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, it very much inspired the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Our entire economy, the last 100 years, has been based on technology. Really just two things. An internal combustion engine and electricity. If it wasn't for those two things, we wouldn't be in this room with lights, with a projector, with a laptop, with cell phones. But there was one very extraordinary discovery that God made about 20 years ago that I think is not even widespread knowledge in the world. And I'll share it with you. You've probably heard a piece of it, which we kind of call Moore's Law. But the discovery, I think, is far more impactful because it speaks to an inevitable future of humanity. And you can see it in a chart. It's a strange chart. The chart goes back 120 years to 1900. And on this left side of the chart is the calculations per second for $1,000. In other words, the price performance of computing. And you can see that over the last 120 years, it's been going up. But what is truly phantasmical about this chart is that this scale is a trick that mathematicians and scientists use in order to compress a chart that is far too big to put on the wall. And so this is not a typical linear scale like the way this is. This is increasing 10 years, every 6 inches or so. But this over here is a logarithmic scale. And so each tick is not sort of 10 more or 1,000 more. Each tick is 10 times more. 10 times more. So this is 10 times more than this, 100 times more, 1,000 times more, 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000 times more, 10 million more, 100 million more, 1 billion times more. Meaning that the price performance of computing today, in 2020, is not a billion times more. It's almost 1 trillion times more, which is truly an astoundingly huge number. And so I'm sure you've heard that your cell phone is more powerful than the computers that were on the rocket that went to the moon. And that's a fact. But the truth is that your cell phone is more powerful than all of the computers that NASA had when we went to the moon. In fact, your cell phone is far more powerful than all of the computers that the entire US government had when we went to the moon. In the late 1990s, I had the privilege to work on the fastest computer in the world. It was called the Cray 2. The Cray 2 was 10 to 100 times faster than the Cray 1s. In fact, it was more powerful than all the Cray supercomputers on the planet put together. Is there anyone that has an Apple Watch in the audience? Not here. If you had an Apple Watch, that Apple Watch has more computing power than that Cray 2 supercomputer. And if you had told me that in the mid-90s, that I would live a life where I would wear a watch faster than the Cray 2 supercomputer, I just wouldn't have believed it. And what we know now is that this accelerating curve, because the real chart, if I made this into a linear scale, the real chart would look a little like this. You'd see it rising. In fact, this is the integrated circuit. So this is Moore's law. But even more before Moore's law, we were seeing this acceleration of the calculations per second for $1,000 with transistors, if you remember them. They were the little, you saw the diodes, and then even before that, we had vacuum tubes. I'm old enough to remember my television when we landed on the moon, and it was a cathode ray tube. And I vividly remember it because I was allowed to stay up until we turned off the TV, and then as the screens would shrink, there would be this little dot that was left, and when that little dot was gone, then I'd have to go to bed. But even before the cathode ray tube, we had solid state relays, and even before that, we had electromechanical devices. And what is so stunning is how linear this chart is on this logarithmic scale. But the real chart doesn't look anything like this. If this was linear, then this curve would slowly steep upward, and this dot would be roughly where the moon is. And so it doesn't fit on the chart. And so we use this logarithmic trick to make it fit. And even stranger is that we now know and feel certain that this will never end. That the price performance of computing, of information technology, will continue to double in its price performance every year or two. And so if you thought that we made a lot of progress in the last 70 years in technology, it's nothing compared to what's about to happen. And that is a truly extraordinary discovery. Made by really one man, He's the most decorated American scientist, Ray Kurzweil, decorated by 5 presidents. If you can imagine 5 presidents, US presidents, agreeing on something. But he also made another discovery, just as extraordinary. And his other discovery was that it wasn't just computing. It wasn't just computing. You think about how much our world has changed because of the exponentially accelerating rate of the price performance of computing. And he discovered that it wasn't just that. And it wasn't just one other thing or 2 other things, but it was actually many. And he discovered that it was computing, but it also was networks. And it was also sensors and robotics and artificial intelligence. And then even a more extraordinary discovery that biology itself, which was run by information, was run by DNA. That DNA was the software of biology. We didn't even make it. That even biology itself was accelerating in this price performance, doubling in our understanding of the information. And the cost to sequence the human genome, $1 billion when we started, it kept halving at 5 times the rate of Moore's law. And now it's $100 to sequence the entire human genome. And nanotechnology and digital fabrication. And so the pace that was already so extraordinary from this one thing, we realized was not just one thing. And so the future of humanity is so difficult to comprehend. In fact, when he looked at the accelerating curves, not just of chips, not just of computing power, but when he looked at the accelerating curves of all of these things, he realized that it was so difficult for us to comprehend that he made a prediction. And he made a set of predictions. In fact, almost 92% of his predictions have all proven to be accurate. And one of the predictions he made was when computers would beat a chess player. And he made the prediction to a year, within a year. And he made a set of other predictions. I won't bore you with all of them, but there was an extraordinary prediction he made, which was when we would have the computing power of an ant, which we just surpassed. And when we will have the computing power of a mouse, and when we will have the computing power of a human brain. And because it's exponential, shortly after that, when we will have the computing power of all the human brains on Earth. Which was 2045. Which is not that far away. And when we have the computing power for $1,000, remember, it's price performance, of all the human brains on the planet, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, for us to predict anything after that. And so he called that the singularity. Because anyone who makes predictions after the year 2045, those predictions are not reliable. This is a result of innovation. But there's another powerful force happening. And I'll show you a photo that I have that captures, more so than anything else I know, this exponentially advancing progress of the price performance of computing. That's it. This phone, I remembered it. I only saw it in movies. These rich venture capitalists had one. I met the inventor of the cell phone several years ago. He's still alive. And I remember asking him, it must have been so extraordinary. When you invented the cell phone, you must have been able to see this extraordinary future. And he said, no. He said, no, not at all. It cost me almost $100,000 just to make the phone. It was $1 million of research, just $100,000 just to make the phone. And I didn't think anyone would ever use it. Because it took all day to charge it, and it lasted less than 10 minutes. I didn't think anyone would use it. And he said when we started to manufacture it in mass, the price dropped. And we finally got it down to $10,000. But it still took all day to charge it and only lasted 10 minutes. And then he said somebody else figured out how to make a $5,000 phone. And it was even smaller. And it was even better. And I was so stunned. Because there'd always been a trade-off with better and cost. In other words, you got the choice. If you made it better, it would cost more. But somebody made it better and it cost less. And I couldn't believe it. And then somebody figured out how to make a $3,000 phone. And it was even better. And at this point, remember this, I know it's obvious to us now that stuff keeps getting better and cheaper, but nobody had a concept of that then. There was no concept yet that stuff could actually keep getting better and cheaper at the same time. It was always the trade-off. And so if you were a really astute company, like Motorola or Symbian, at this point, you could already see the pattern. And so they jumped into it. They jumped into it, and they actually made a cheaper, better phone. And they understood they could make a cheaper, better phone. So they made a cheaper, better phone, and a cheaper, better phone, and again a cheaper, better phone, and a cheaper, better phone until here. Because what should have happened? I mean, we should have gotten a cheaper, better phone. But it didn't make sense. And so nobody knew what would happen. And when the glass phone arrived, the glass phone was so different than all of the prior innovations that two new companies arrived into the cell phone industry that nobody had ever heard of. And they completely dominated the industry in 3.5 years. In just 3.5 years, the entire cell phone industry gets completely dominated by two new players who entered the industry that nobody had ever heard of in the cell phone industry, and they dominate the entire industry. And these companies, some of which were $100 billion in valuation. 4 years later, the major one, it sold off to Microsoft for $7 billion. $100 billion to $7 billion in just 4 years. We'd never seen that before. No one had ever seen something like that happen before. And Microsoft, to this day, is still pissed off that they paid $7 billion for it. And so the question is, how does this happen? The company was Nokia. How could this happen? And there were only two reasonable explanations that people could come up with. The first was that the people who worked at Nokia were not smart enough. And so they didn't make the glass phone. They just were not smart enough. They didn't have the best talent in the world. Which wasn't true. In fact, Nokia had so much money, being a $100 billion company, that they could afford and paid for the best talent in the world. The best engineers, the best business people, the best marketing people, the best innovators. They had the best people in the world. The other reason seemed obvious. That Nokia must not have been innovative enough. This is not even all the phones that Nokia created. This is just the phones that Nokia created and successfully brought to market where customers were buying them. Nokia was not one of the most innovative cell phone companies. Nokia was one of the most innovative companies in the world, in any industry. You could not find a company more innovative than Nokia. I don't know if you've seen these in some of my companies. I used to have motivational posters that I would put on the wall. And then I learned that there was a company called Despair.com. And they made demotivation posters. And this was one of the winners. Because nothing says you're a loser more than owning a motivational poster about being a winner. And one of my employees put that up on the wall. And then I took down all the motivational posters. But here's another one. Mistakes. It could be that the purpose of our company is only to serve as a warning to others. And Nokia was the warning. And the warning was this. We've been talking about disruptive innovation now for almost 30 years. It's driven everything that you've seen happening in the last 30 years has been this disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation, disruptive innovation, disruptive innovation. And the realization from Nokia is that disruption and innovation are not the same thing. They're completely different things. See, in innovation, you do the same things better. And big companies are fantastic at this. They're fantastic at it because they're a big company and they can go off and ask the customer what they want. And the customer will tell them, I want this. And then they go back to their marketing department. Their marketing creates some ideas. They give it to their engineering department. Their engineering builds it. And then they deliver it to their product delivery and they give it back to the customer. The customer says exactly what I was looking for. And now I want this. And then this cycle continues of innovation and they do the same things better. But then you can just sometimes do new things. Three years ago, I spent some time with a wonderful company called Ferrero Chocolate. And they make the Rochero chocolates. Do you know these? The gold-wrapped round chocolates. Fantastic chocolate. Does unbelievably well in China and things where they like the gold. And do well in Auroville. And so the CEO is a brilliant, warm, compassionate man. And I'm so impressed by him that I spent some time there. I was going to just spend the day, but instead I spent a few days. And then I learned that the company also created Nutella. And Nutella is sort of like chocolate. But actually, it's mostly palm oil. So it's not chocolate, it's a different thing. And so they were able to sort of divest out of chocolate. They weren't dependent on chocolate. And Nutella is not like chocolate, it's used differently. You spread it on a sandwich, you do things that you would never do with chocolate. They didn't buy a company called Nutella, they created something new that they had never done before. And then I learned that they also had created Tic Tacs, little mints. Everybody know Tic Tac? So, I mean, Tic Tacs aren't even chocolate. They didn't buy a Tic Tac company. They came up with the new idea of a minty rattler thing that you keep in your pocket to freshen your breath. They came up with something new. And then, now, they're actually the largest toy company in the world. Because they came up with, are they called like Kinders or something?
Kinder Toys.
Kinder Toys. They have these little kind of chocolates, but there's a toy inside. And because it sells so well, they're the largest toy manufacturer in the world. And so they didn't just do the same things better, they just did new things. But disruption is not either of these. Disruption is when you do new things that make the old things obsolete. And big companies are terrible at this. Because to make the old thing obsolete would mean that you would have to destroy your own company. And so I want you to imagine if all of you were the leaders of a very large company that we have. We'll call it the Auroville Corporation. And it was a huge corporation. And then this lovely gentleman in this beautiful shirt comes up with an idea. A disruptive idea. Now typically, if we're a company, our company may be growing 5%, maybe 10% a year. Because we keep doing the same things better. We keep growing. Companies like to do that. But this gentleman comes up with an idea, a disruptive one. And typically what happens is the CEO will hear this idea and realize, because CEOs are outward facing, and they'll realize how extraordinary the idea is. Because disruptive ideas, they grow at extraordinary rates, 50% or 100% a year. They double typically every year, for years on end. And so typically the CEO, when they hear this idea, they'll be so excited about it. And then they come to the company and they say, what's your name? Patrick. Team, Patrick has come up with a disruptive idea. And we believe it will grow at 50 to 100% a year. And in fact, if this is successful, we will not need this 2/3 of the company. So aren't you excited about this? Now help me with Patrick's idea. Send some of your best people to Patrick. Give me some of your budget to Patrick. What we've learned is that when disruptive ideas germinate in a company, that the entire company's antibody system will react to this in the same way that it would in your own body. And that because of 100 different ways, it will destroy Patrick's idea. And Patrick, too, somehow, will be destroyed and discredited in the process. And so disruptive ideas never evolve in companies that don't understand how to grow a disruptive idea. And so, big companies typically never do disruption. Not because they can't learn it, but because of this antibody problem that happens inside of a big company. And so, disruptive ideas only get done by startups. So, this is a challenging concept. It's critical to get. Innovation and disruption. They're two totally different things. Perhaps Auroville has been growing, evolving, innovating, being better every year, for years and years. And who knows? maybe something disruptive would start to happen. And if you're only familiar with innovation, you'll be frightened about this disruption. But if you understand that evolution of anything, even us, humanity, Homo sapiens, happens through both innovation and disruption. You see the sequence. The sequence is clear. Innovation, 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 innovation. There's this pattern, but eventually something very different has to happen. It has to happen. Because it doesn't make sense anymore. Because not only has this path itself changed, but the world is changing too. And if the world changes too, then the disruption must happen. The innovation will not continue. This is true for companies. This is true for organizations. This is true for people. So, now we see the phone not getting smaller, but actually getting bigger. And so if you understand innovation, it should be very easy to predict what the iPhone 20 is going to look like. And the iPhone 30 will be even easier. And you know that that's not what's going to happen. That's not what's going to happen. And if that can't happen, then a new disruption has to happen. Something different, significantly, has to happen. And we're about to see that happen with the phone. I'll give you a glimpse of it. Instead of the primary way that we measure the phone being smaller or bigger, the phone will have a new attribute. And the new attribute will be intelligence. In fact, what we know now, because artificial intelligence is also, if you remember, an exponentially advancing technology. And actually, it doesn't get any cheaper. So it just gets better. Because it's software. Software typically doesn't get cheaper. It just stays the same price. So it just keeps getting better. And it actually doesn't double in its performance every year. Stunningly, artificial intelligence has been doubling in its performance every 4 months. And the prediction now, if you also believe Ray Kurzweil's prediction about computing technology, is that in 20 years, your phone will be smarter than you. And that is a very strange thing to grasp. I mean, I guarantee it. If I came here 20 years ago, and I said to you, in 20 years, you will carry a little device, and on it, it will draw information just from the air and pull it into your phone, and you will be able to access the entire world's information. You would think that's probably not very likely. But the likelihood that your phone will be smarter than you is quite high. And you would never guess that today, especially from using our phone. This is, I mean, if you use the phone today, I have an iPhone, so I use Siri. You'd never guess it. So here's this. A few years ago, I said to Siri, I am going to jump off a bridge and die. I had a terrible day. That's what I said to Siri. Siri said, I found 4 bridges. Helpful. Until I looked at the answers, and then it wasn't even bridges. It was like the Bridge of Faith, Bridge Consultants, Inc. It wasn't even bridges, so it wasn't actually helpful. So there's some funny. I mean, I know it's a little morbid on this topic. But I still thought there was some humor in it. And so about a year later, I remembered showing it to somebody as a joke. And I said, watch this. And I said the same thing. I'm going to jump off a bridge and die. But this time Siri said something different. This time Siri said, if you're thinking about suicide, you may want to speak with someone. Shall I call them for you? In other words, Siri learned. Somehow, Siri recognized that the responses it was getting when it gave that other answer wasn't the responses it was expecting from the human, and so probably it notified a human being. And a human being looked at it and said, oh my gosh, don't say that. Say this. In other words, Siri learned the same way you and I learn. I mean, I maybe had 20 conversations today. I learned from each one of them. Siri has had a couple million conversations just in the last minute. Siri is learning at a pace that the founders and the engineers of Siri never imagined possible. Which is funny because I'm still able to trick Siri up. Remind me to kill myself tomorrow. Siri says, okay, I'll remind you. But I just tried this. And even this doesn't work anymore. Siri gives an answer more like that. Siri knows now that anytime I'm kind of presenting this doomed self topic, that it has to be careful about the response. And it's not just Siri. I mean, Alexa, which is made by Amazon, and Google makes Google Now, and Cortana is made by Microsoft, and now the Chinese, there's a couple companies, they each have their own. And there's so many. If you use a couple phones, you can get them confused. Here's one. Cortana, Microsoft's, get me today's movie times. Who's Cortana? Oops, I meant Siri. Who is Cortana? Please get me the movie times. Maybe you should ask Cortana. I mean, Siri's developed a sense of humor. If you've used Siri, Siri's quite funny. Siri's getting funny exponentially faster. In 20 years, Siri will be the funniest person that you speak to. Siri will be funnier than any human being on earth. Siri will know you better than any human being on earth. You will talk to Siri more than any other human being. The relationship between technology and humans is not that different than the relationship between humans and Mother Earth. We're dependent. We have a dependent relationship on Mother Earth. I realize many leaders and politicians have not fully comprehended this. But we cannot live without Mother Earth. But this relationship today, as this shows, there's a tension in there. There's a tension in our relationship with technology. And it happens in many ways, and we've labeled it. We have a part of our brain, in fact, a part of our brain that very much prevents us from reaching enlightenment. There's a part of our brain that likes to divide, that likes to label, that likes to separate. And we've given technology a label. Artificial. It's artificial. We're natural, but technology is artificial. Computing is artificial. Even the intelligence that computing has is artificial. In fact, we call it artificial intelligence. So let me ask you this. Is the bird natural? Yeah, the bird is natural. Is the nest natural? Yeah, the nest is natural. The bird made the nest. In other words, the nest is just bird technology. It's a fact. When a beaver makes a dam, is the beaver natural? Yes. Is the dam natural? Yes. Does the dam affect millions of organisms? Yes. And is the dam natural? Yes. When Homo sapiens make technology, we are not that different. It feels so different to us. Maybe even to a beaver, the dam might feel so different. The bird might feel that the nest is so different. But it's just not that different. It's all the same stuff. It's all the same stuff. The boundary and the label that we use to create and separate ourselves doesn't help us. When cars first got created, there were people that got tense about the car. They were comfortable with the horse, but the car, they knew, would eventually go faster than the horse. In fact, there was a long time where people believed when we reached 60 miles an hour that the back of the heart would not catch up to the front. It would not and that that would be the barrier. We would have a heart attack once we got faster than 60 miles an hour. And so somehow the car was competitive at that time. There were people that believed it was competitive because it would run faster than we could. And it was true. It would run faster than we could, but it wasn't competitive because we build cars to serve us. And so we just get in the car. In fact, we're glad that the car runs faster than we do. When we make a submarine, the submarine swims farther and faster than we could ever swim. But we like it. Because we get in the submarine. We build the submarine to serve us. And sometimes we can build things that do things that we can't even do. And we like it. Because we build them to serve us. And now, the very challenging aspect is that now we are starting to build things that think. And they will think in many ways better than we do. But recognize, we build them to serve us. Some people may build them for malpurpose. You can build a knife for malpurpose. This was a real photo, taken in London a few years ago. Martin LeMay, the photographer, was taking photos of a robin, and a weasel ran up and jumped on the back of the robin, and the robin flew away with the weasel on the back. About 300 meters, and then landed, and the weasel hopped off with a pretty good story to tell. I used to think of technology as two separate things, but now I've realized that we're this bird. The technology is the weasel. In fact, it's not even clear anymore that maybe we're the weasel. And the bird is the technology. It's not clear, but what's clear is that we're slowly starting to fuse with our technology. We're starting to fuse with it. The computer used to be the size of this room. And then you could take it and stick it in the office. We had a mini computer. And then you could stick it on a desk in your office at home. And then it turned into somehow an iPhone. And now we carry it with us. And now we have a watch. In fact, when I have an iPhone watch, I use it more even than I use my phone. It keeps fusing. It keeps fusing with us. There's at least 250,000 people on the planet that wear what's called a cochlear implant. Maybe some of you might be wearing it here. And it allows them to hear. But understand, it's actually communicating directly with the nerves in their brain, making the little tick, tick, tick on the nerve of the brain and allowing them to hear. It's fully fused. And they would never be able to hear without it. Understand what this means about our future. This is another extraordinary chart, also Ray Kurzweil. It was probably the third extraordinary insight he made. And this chart is even weirder than the other one, because not only is it logarithmic on this scale, but it's also logarithmic on that scale. And this scale is how much time passes before the next thing happens. And on this scale, it's how much time to the actual next event. And so you can see the extraordinary events that have happened in terms of information in our universe. And you can see there was a Milky Way, and then there was life on Earth, and then the first single-cell organisms, and then the first multi-cell. And you see there's an unbelievable straightness to this chart, which is completely unexpected. In fact, if you were to remove the logarithmic aspect of one of these dimensions, you'd see the truth of the chart. And the truth of the chart is that everything is happening right now. In other words, the universe is not, even though it's been expanding linearly since the very beginning, the explosion that's happening of information, which defies the most important law that we have in the universe, which is this idea of entropy, that things continue to get more disorganized. It's been an immutable law. In fact, there is no other law that's higher than this one. This is the immutable law of the universe. And it's true in thermodynamics, electromechanics, any science that you look at, there's this immutable law that information continues to just get more and more disorganized as the universe progresses. But this chart says that something else is happening. That somehow the universe is reversing. That something extraordinary has happened on at least one rock spinning around a sun in one of 100 billion galaxies. I want you to understand what's happening here. Grasp this. Even the evolution of mankind, even if you looked at the evolution of mankind, if you think that the next thing is a bigger, fatter skull, you will not have understood what we've learned. The next thing is not a bigger, fatter skull. Something really different is about to happen. And all of this is happening because we have a 3-pound brain. It's happening because we can think. Everything. Everything that we have, it's because we think. We think. And the spectrum of intelligence must be huge. It must be huge. But we know where we are on it. We're slightly smarter than this. That's it. You go one level down, and you're that. And it's not that this is smart enough to use tools. Hundreds of animals on the planet are smart enough to use tools. It's that for that extra 2 pounds, you can have tools that make other tools. And then you get smartphones and plasma screen TVs and all this other stuff. In other words, this tiny extra intelligence gets us all this stuff. And so recognize what is about to happen because of AI. We're not going to increase our intellect by a tiny bit. We're about to increase it by a truly magnanimous bit. And so all of this happened because of the extra 2 pounds. And even though we don't measure it that way, we're not going to get an extra 2 pounds of brain with AI. We're going to get extra hundreds, thousands of pounds of intellect. problems that we never imagined possible to solve will begin to be solved. Well, one of the hardest things to do with the human mind is something called protein folding. So if you have a complex molecule, say with just 7 atoms in it, it's very, very difficult for the human brain to figure out how it folds. And so we've never been able to do that. We were able to crack DNA, not because we knew the chemical composition of it, but we had no idea what it looked like. And it was only through this X-ray mechanism that we used one day that a woman saw it, and then she cracked the code and realized it was a helix. It was an extraordinary discovery. But recognize, we can't fold proteins. It's just way too complex and hard. And we've been trying to do it. In fact, the best protein folder in the world, somebody made a piece of software so that any of us can get on and try some protein folding. And the best woman in the world at it, in the strangest phenomena, happened to be a secretary in London. She got on and she just started trying to do it. She just had the knack. It wasn't some brilliant scientist. It was just this secretary. And her brain was just really good at it. So she did the best protein folding in the world. In the last year and a half, an AI has solved nearly every protein folding problem that we've had with biology. One AI just solved them all. And so the biggest problems in the world could begin to be solved. And because of it, actually, because of this one AI, we're going to understand diseases and the solutions to them and we'll understand a whole set of things that we never could have ever understood. And so grasp this. Grasp that in the last 20 years we got 2 things that really changed the world. We had the internet and we got the phone. And grasp that in the next 20 years we're not going to get 2 things. We're going to get 5 or 10 or 20 things of that magnitude. We don't even know. Because every time we combine them together, we realize that something new and extraordinary is going to happen. And so the future is not like the past. I mean, it's been like the past. If you were born in the 1500s, your kids would live a life exactly like you. And if you were born even in the 1800s, your kids would live a life pretty much like you. But I think probably you all realize that your kids are not living a life like you lived. I mean, I vividly remember my childhood where we had a wired phone in the house. And I had a sister that was always on the phone, and so the calls couldn't come in, and I couldn't get on a call. And if I was out, I mean, I wasn't near the phone. I'd have to wait to get home to make a call. It's so hard to even grasp. In fact, my nephew, he's 24 years old. He's like, how did you ever organize a party when you were in college? And I had to think, because it was so hard to remember. And I was like, oh yeah, we would make a poster, and then we'd have to go to the university secretly and sneak in to the copy machine room, because copy machines were so expensive. And then we would run off copies of where and when our party was. And then we would go out and staple these party advertisements on telephone poles around Boston. And then we'd have to take turns being bouncers at the door, because all these people would show up that we didn't want to show up. And I mean, it was such a strange thing to think of a world where we didn't have Facebook and phones. But recognize, humanity is growing at an extraordinary pace in its capabilities and its power. These ants, have brains the size of a pin. And they can search for and navigate and find a very particular kind of tree. And then they navigate and climb up the tree to the leaves of the tree, and then they cut a leaf out, just the right size. And then they balance the leaf on their back, on the center of gravity on their back. And then they navigate all the way back to their particular underground city. And then they navigate to a very particular room in that underground city, and they plant the leaf. So that 3 days later, the leaf grows mushrooms, which they then can eat. And that is just one of the many, many tasks that these ants do. And they have a brain the size of a pin. This ant can sense this finger, but it cannot comprehend what's behind the finger. It cannot comprehend the human or its intellect that's behind the finger. It cannot comprehend robotics or the blockchain or digital biology. It can never comprehend it because its brain is the size of a pin. But understand, this ant represents us today. And this is our very near future. A future that is so complex, it will be difficult for us to ever even comprehend. Humanity gets unfathomably powerful. And here's the problem with that. What does this picture say about the kind of beings that we are? Because she is crawling to a food station that is located more than 1 kilometer away. And we have had enough food on the planet to feed everyone. In fact, 1.5 times over for at least the last 70 years in a row. We've just never chosen to do it. So what does it say about the kind of species that we are? I mean, we can easily become very powerful and not very compassionate, not very kind. In fact, it's quite easy for us, it's probably easier for us to grow in our power and actually become less kind. And so what kind of species are we? What would it mean if we managed to explore the entire universe and learn all knowledge and be incompassionate souls? I believe it would be a complete and total waste of a millennium. It'd be a worthless trip. This photo changed my life. I had a teaching assistant in 2011. His father was the best friend of the man who took this photo. I vividly remember him taking me into a back room and sitting with me and impressing with me on the moment that we were about to have when he showed me this photo. Because he was from the country where this photo was taken, in Somalia. His father's best friend, Kevin Carter, took the photo. And several months later, he won the Pulitzer Prize for that photo, the highest prize that any human can win for a photograph. And so he flew to get the award. And while he was on stage, just after he had received the reward, someone in the audience asked and yelled out, "What happened to the little girl?" And he said, he didn't know. Because he took the photo and he walked away. And I remember judging him for it. Perfectly timed. Who takes a photo of a girl with a vulture behind her and walks away. And then being honest with myself. Later that evening. And thinking, after judging him, how am I any different than Kevin Carter? I mean, I knew there were people starving in the world. What was I doing about it? The answer was nothing. At least Kevin went and took a photo. Kevin takes his own life several months after that. Several weeks after that. He leaves a note in regret. Not just of that instant, but other instances too. And to me, there was a message in it. And I remember then showing the photo to the class the next day. I spoke to the teaching assistant. We got his permission. And he showed it to the class. And I remember making a completely inappropriate comment that I greatly regret making. And I remember saying, because I thought it at the time too, that it was just Africa. Mostly Africa. And there was a woman in the back corner of the class that night. And she sent me an email. And it was titled, "It's not just Africa." And she included this photo. A little boy also starving in the country that I was flying to in Eastern Europe the next day. And I was troubled. Troubled by what I said and what I thought. But not enough, because I rationalized it again. And I said, I remember vividly thinking, well, it's just food. It's mostly food. And then quickly regretting that and realizing it wasn't just food. 800 million people in the world drink bad water every day. And as a result of it, half of the hospitalizations in the world originate from the people who drink bad water. I want you to think about the cost of half of the hospitalizations in the world. I mean, it's in the trillions. And the cost to fix the clean water problem is probably just 20 or 30 billion. But we won't do it. And so what does it say about the kind of species that we are? Here's a question. There's a big hole in front of where you live. And you're there, sitting there, and there's a person walking around the hole, but they're blind. But they're stumbling around the hole, and you're watching them. And then, of course, they fall down the hole. Who is at fault? I mean, if you're watching, and you could have done something about it, clearly, we're at fault. And what I'm describing to you is not about the financial divide. I know I used two examples of food and clean water, and it seems like it's an issue of the financial divide. That's not actually the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that we do all kinds of dumb things. We do all kinds of dumb things, and And they negatively affect all of us, no matter what economic bracket you're in. And the gap between having an action, deliberate or indeliberate, that negatively affects so many people, and not doing that, the gap between the two is what? It's an insight. It's not about wanting to be kinder. It's not about wanting to be more loving. It's an insight about the truth. And the truth is that even though a long time ago we didn't know how big the world was, it just seemed like it was infinitely big. The oceans seemed enormous. In fact, they seemed so big that if you sailed out, you would just drop off the edge of the ocean. And so because people believed it, they wouldn't even go. The belief prevented them from going. And the air just seemed infinite. And so we treated it that way. But the truth is that this is all the water in the world if you picked it up and put it into a ball. Everything. 99% of it is seawater, 98%, 1% is in the ice cap, 1% is the fresh water that we drink. And it seems so small. In fact, if I made just the bubble of the fresh water, you wouldn't be able to see it on this chart. But understand, in that little circle of fresh water, there is enough fresh water easily for 100 trillion human beings. There is no shortage of fresh water. 100 trillion human beings without even impacting the environment. There is no shortage of fresh water in the world. We just don't distribute fresh water. And that is a problem of leadership, not scarcity. We have 1.5 times the amount of food in the world. We don't distribute it. That is a problem of leadership. We have enough energy that falls on this planet that if we just took even a 20-mile square area, we'd have enough energy for almost all of India. We have plenty of it. It's not scarcity, it's leadership. And that's all the air in the world. And so we have to think about things differently. Because it's the same water, it's the same air. We don't get new water. We don't get new air, it's the same stuff. We keep reusing it. And because of the way our entire globe is connected, you have at least 500,000 atoms in you that were in the Buddha. It's just how atoms spread. It's just how it works. I think you have 14 quadrillion atoms or something like that. It's an enormous number, but it's just how everything spreads. I got one of these. Anybody have one of these? I got it as a gift a long time ago. I had it for a week. It got cloudy and everything died. It's a sealed glass ball. There's no opening. And there's 4 shrimp inside. The shrimp produce CO2. And then typically algae grow on this branch. And then the algae takes the CO2 and produce oxygen, which the shrimp breathe. And then the shrimp eat the algae, and then they actually poop the algae, which the algae live off. It's a perfect ecosphere. And I mentioned this to another faculty member, wonderful, brilliant guy, Raymond McCauley. And Raymond says, oh, well, you just left it in the sun too long. And then 2 weeks later, I got one in the mail. Raymond, loving man. He says, don't leave it in the sun too long. So I took it and put it on my shelf inside. 4 years later, there were still 4 shrimp alive. I didn't even know shrimp lived that long. And then a shrimp died, and then a shrimp. Now there's only 1 shrimp left, but it's been almost 6 years, I think. But if I were to take that, and if I had moved it into the window where it was getting too much sunlight, everything would get out of whack. And everything would get cloudy and it would all die, probably in a week. And scientists believe that our world is just like that. I mean, we live in something that's like a sealed glass ball. And And so it's not just that we're doing things that say are raising the temperature of the globe. That's not the issue. The issue is that there's tipping points. See, the Earth has been a net carbon absorber, which means if we stopped putting CO2 into the air, the trees would take the CO2 and produce oxygen. The plankton would take that CO2 and produce oxygen. And then it would come back to normal. But the world has a tipping point. Just like this has a tipping point. If I tilt it a little bit, it'll come back. If I tilt it even more, it may still come back. But at some point, I tilt it too much, and it'll accelerate and fall to the ground. And scientists believe, some, that we've already tilted things too much. That the melting even of the ice caps, which reflect an enormous amount of light, now that light is not being reflected, it's being absorbed. And so now even more warmth is there, which accelerates even more ice melting. And we may have passed the tipping point, and the Earth may have already become a net carbon producer. And if that is true, it will keep accelerating. And we may have no ability to control it. And if you were to look at the CO2 levels, not just for the last 50,000 years, which is what we used to do, but for the last 800,000 years, you could see the CO2 levels, and you could see we're off the chart. In fact, since I put this chart, we're not at 405, we're at 420 already. We're so far off. We're so far off that even if we stop putting all the CO2 in the air tomorrow, there's way too much CO2 in the air. There's billions of tons of CO2. It's not fully irreversible. We will get the melt. In fact, if you remember, during these higher CO2 levels, when the Earth was warmer, the sea level was 200 feet higher. So I want you to think, if the water's 200 feet higher, what kind of mass migration we might have. And think how calamitous it's been just to have 2 or 3 million people in the last 10 years from, say, Syria, and the amount of commotion and disruption that it caused. And so I want you to imagine, not 2 or 3 million, but 150 million people, just at the very beginning of it, having to migrate and move. So we have some really challenging times coming ahead. And it's not just one tipping point. It turns out there's 15 different tipping points just for global warming. And global warming is not the only thing. In fact, the scientists I speak to think this isn't even the biggest issue. They think ocean acidification is the biggest issue, which is CO2 when it goes into the ocean. There's a reaction that occurs, and it then becomes a little more acidic. And the acidity level rises, and then the coral, which have this symbiotic relationship on the algae that live inside it, which give the coral the color, it becomes too acidic, and then the coral ejects the algae. That's what we call the bleached coral. But the coral's dependent on the algae for food. And so 2 years later, the coral dies. 3 years ago, I visited the Great Barrier Reef. In 2016, 90% of the Great Barrier Reef bleached. 1/3 of the 800-mile-long Great Barrier Reef died. And scientists believe that in 20 years, we may lose almost certainly 1/3 of the world's coral. And if we lose 1/3 of the world's coral, they also believe we'll lose 1/3 of the world's fish. And right now, humanity, for the most part, is dependent on its protein from fish. That's just one problem. 2 years ago, I visited Hawaii. Now you get a feeling for our very strange planet, which is mostly water. Hawaii is the most distant piece of land from any other major source of land. And I visited the beach in Hawaii that was not cleaned up by the hotels, and it's covered in plastic, none of which comes from Hawaii. In fact, there is so much plastic in the ocean that if you have used table salt that did not come out of the Himalaya mountains, you will have been eating plastic today. Because every time we have washed our polyester clothes, those plastic polyester fibers end up in the ocean. And for the same reason, we have 500,000 atoms of the Buddha in us, or anybody else that lived some time ago, you will have been eating plastic. Because we live in a spaceship. We live in a sealed glass ball. Anything we do that is not fully circular is poisoning ourselves. And this is the insight. And when you have the insight, then it becomes very difficult to do anything. Do we want to turn on the fans or do a little more? No, good, okay. I want to show you a video. And I need to show you the video because I want to make 2 points that are hard, I think, to grasp without showing you the video. But I'll warn you ahead of time that the video is a little bit violent. And the video is of a herd of buffalo, 100 buffalo. You won't see them in the beginning. And then at the front of that herd is a big male buffalo and a mama buffalo and a little baby buffalo. And buffalo don't see very well, and so they're all sort of stumbling up, and they don't realize it, but they're about to walk into 5 lions. And the lions actually just ate, so they're not that hungry, but it's kind of hard to miss out on a free lunch that just walks into you. And so as you watch the video, I want you to think about 2 things. I want you to think about the herding instinct, which is the instinct for us to help each other, which animals share with us, and the self-preservation instinct, which is the instinct to identify only with ourselves and want to preserve ourselves. And I want you to think about those 2 things as you watch it.
That is a huge buffalo.
It's a huge buffalo.
It's a huge buffalo.
One's gone already.
So there's the 5 lions. You saw the mama buffalo, baby buffalo.
They're crouching.
He's crouching.
5 lions. Lions see really well. They already have seen the buffalo. Buffalo haven't seen them yet. But buffalo smell really well. So they can actually, they will smell the lions before they see them. In fact, you can see that buffalo smelling now the lion, having its head tilting, trying to get the direction of this smell, so you can smell the lions. There's 5 of them. Here we go. They go after the fittest.
She's going for him. She got him. Oh, she did.
Turn it down just a little bit, please. Can we turn it down a little bit? So 5 lions, they've got this baby. Now lions hate water. And they hate water because for all of their generations, lions weigh 200 or 300 pounds, but the waters are infested with crocodiles. A crocodile will weigh 1,500 pounds. So they're trying to get this baby out of the water as quickly as they can. But in the meantime, a crocodile has already come up, and you can't see it, but there's a little tiny splash, and it's actually going to try and grab that male lion. Boom! It missed, because the lion is such fast reaction. So now the male lion's hissing at it, and sure enough, this crocodile is going to steal their lunch. Watch this. Boom. Crocodile's got the baby. Crocodile pulling in. Look at this. The lion's herding instinct, helping each other. Here's the CEO in the back. Tug of war going on. There's actually another crocodile in the water too. There's 2 crocodiles. And so the lions don't want to go in. But look at this. The herding instinct helping each other, they manage to win the tug of war. And in the meantime, the other buffalo had a meeting. And they've decided that they're going to come back for this baby. Now, buffalo usually run from lions. Watch the CEO. And now something incredible is about to happen. One buffalo is going to get a crazy idea.
because he cannot believe what's going on here. There's a big terrier that he's lions, crocodiles, and buffalo.
He's going to charge a lion. He charges. He turns around to run, but he realizes that just worked. And now that buffalo chases lions. Now he's inspired. He has an insight. He understands differently. He comes back and he does this. Ooh. And now lions are running. And buffalo that are witnessing and watching this are chasing lions. And now these buffalo are not so afraid. And so they are starting to move in. And here our baby buffalo, inspired, is standing up. And sure enough, walks away. This is what humans call stubbornness. They don't even have the baby lion, but they're still trying to hold their ground. But these buffalo don't think the same anymore. And today, at least, they are not afraid of lions. And so they are chasing all of the lions away. And I've cut the video down to just 5 minutes instead of 8. But if you were to watch the 8-minute video, there's a very beautiful moment where that male lion gets far enough away that he turns around and just stares back. Like, what the heck just happened? How did we end up 5 lions with 1 baby buffalo running from buffalo today? Two insights to get from this. One, we don't have, there we go. One, perpetrators. Not that the lions were perpetrators, but I think we were all rooting for the baby buffalo. Perpetrators, collaborators, the crocodiles helping out too, the bystanders, all those buffalo not involved, the victim, the baby buffalo. We can be clear about 3 of these categories. The bystander, however, is the fulcrum. Fulcrum, point of change. I didn't understand this quote for the longest time. Perpetrators, collaborators, bystanders, victims. You find any time that humans are harming each other, and you'll actually see these 4 players. We can be clear about 3 of them. The bystander, however, is the fulcrum. All those buffalo that were not involved, when they chose to be involved, everything stopped. Bystanders have all the power for change. In fact, now we know bystanders are the only entity that has the power to change anything. Because these 3, perpetrators, collaborators, and victims, can't change. Perpetrators and collaborators are benefiting, and the victim can't stop it. Example, victim, slave owner, the perpetrator, people buying these bricks or cotton or whatever it is, collaborators. That went on, slavery went on for hundreds of years. And it wasn't until all the people that were not involved said that's enough that it stopped. Bystanders, you and I, are the only entity that has the power to change everything harmful that happens in our world. And the problem, part of the problem, is that perpetrators often hang out with other perpetrators. And so without deep introspection, it becomes very difficult for them to see their own harmful ways, their wrongdoing. And I know, you may be looking at this and think, well, clearly I would never have been involved in slavery. Clearly I would never have been involved in Nazism or killing innocent people. I would never have been involved in those things. I'm not so sure. I think we're involved in those things now. I'll show you an example. I do it when I'm in the West. Not so much India. We know they suffer. We know they suffer. We scan their brains when they're suffering. We know they suffer. It's not just that they tear up and cry. We know. Just when they're contained in a cage their whole life, we know that they're suffering. And we know that it's not really ethical. There's something not quite right about it. And so we don't like to think about it. Because then we would be suffering too if we thought that they taste so good to some people who grew up tasting them. Maybe some others. And we know that it's not sustainable. It's not just that it's not sustainable, it's actually so unsustainable that now it is 20% of our biggest problem, global warming. 20% of our biggest problem is due to this one unethical thing. And to add to that, eating too much of this will be, for the people doing it, the number one reason that they will die earlier than they should. The number one cause of death by far is a heart attack caused by atherosclerosis, a hardening of the arteries, which we now have certainly linked to eating too much meat. And the number two cause of death is stroke, which is caused by the exact same thing. And so it's the most likely thing to kill you. And it's completely unsustainable, and it's completely questionably ethical, and yet we still do it. And so here's the realization. Everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change. Point number two. Point number two I call the third thing. And it just means this. Like animals, we too have a herding instinct. We want to help each other, and we have a self-preservation instinct. And so if you hear someone scream down a dark alley, there is a part of you, a herding instinct, that wants to go down and help. And there is a self-preservation instinct, like the CEO lion, that says, I don't want to go down and help because I might get hurt. But because we are slightly smarter than an ape, because we get the extra 2 pounds of brain, we have an insight, a concept, that the right thing to do would be to go down and help. We have a moral value. We're not fully sure where it comes from, but we have a belief that the herding instinct could potentially be more important than the self-preservation instinct to our mind's comfort and balance of compassion and fear. And my belief is that even animals are aware when they do something that might be harmful. I'm a little strange that I'm about to show you a cat video, but I think this cat might actually know the difference, and maybe you can tell me if you think the same. How do we make a difference? You cannot make a difference if you do not believe you can make a difference. If you don't believe you can make a difference, you'll never try in the slightest way to make a difference. And so first we have to understand the belief that we can solve, even as a bystander, the world's biggest problems. Is that possible? This was one of the biggest problems in the world. I mean, really. The ozone hole was growing out of control. Protecting us from all UV light on the planet was growing out of control for 20 years in a row. In fact, if it had reached the halfway point, it would have been the tipping point. And it probably would have never recovered, because it would have bubbled up on the other side and never spread. And so people who weren't responsible for fixing ozone holes, like you and I, got together and decided that they were going to fly around the world and visit country leaders and business leaders and tell them to reduce the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons that were producing the ozone hole. And they just did it. They just flew around the world and they convinced enough people to reduce the CFCs, and the ozone hole, for at least the last 7 years now, has been shrinking or stabilized, depending on which scientists you think. In other words, one of the worst global problems in the world was solved, not by the UN, not by any particular government, not by the ozone fixing club, but a group of people, bystanders like you and I. They just got together, they flew around the world, they had influence, and they fixed one of the biggest problems in the world. They showed up. It's one of the requirements of being an extraordinary leader. You got to show up. One, you got to believe you can actually solve the problem, and two, then you actually have to show up. The United Nations was created shortly after the Second World War. 2 world wars in a row. Astounding. The world could not and did not want to survive a 3rd World War. So they create the United Nations to stop the 3rd World War. They've done an unbelievable job. We've not had a 3rd World War. 70 years in a row without another world war. We give them credit for that. I do. It became clear about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that stopping World War III was not the biggest problem in the world. And so a group of people got together and went to the UN to convince the UN that stopping World War III was not the biggest problem in the world, that we had other bigger problems that they should be focused on. My belief at the time, I vividly remember it, was that it would take 20 to 30 years. Why? The UN, universally, maybe agreed on, is one of the most political organizations in the world. The UN is one of the most bureaucratic organizations in the world. One of the most bureaucratic and one of the most political. And to disrupt themselves, I talked to you about how challenging disruption is. To disrupt themselves must take 20 to 30 years. How long does it take them? 4 years. The UN disrupts itself and becomes all about the biggest problems in the world. Not one of which was stopping World War III. Here's the point. If the UN, as the most bureaucratic and political organization in the world, can disrupt itself in just 4 years, then no other organization in the world has an excuse. Truly an awesome accomplishment. And one that continues to bring into my heart an optimism about the future of humanity. In times where I often have doubts about the future of global leadership, but this was extraordinary. And after looking at this and thinking about it for a while, they didn't take all of them, by the way. There were some other things. There was one in particular that I thought should have been included in that wasn't. They didn't take them all, but they took 17. And they thought and they believed that really, if you could get the world to focus on it, we could solve all of those within the next 15 years. That may or may not happen, but clearly the world is actually now focused on this. Some countries taking it much more seriously than others. Now you've probably heard of moon shots. That's the exciting new thing to do, the moon shot. Get a moon shot. No one believed we could go to the moon. Somebody said, let's go to the moon. Everybody get galvanized and then they go to the moon. And so find the biggest problem in your company or in your country or in your organization and do the moon shot and try and solve it. The truth is that we didn't go to the moon to solve a problem. We didn't. We went to the moon because it was just extraordinary. It was just an extraordinary capability, potentially, of humanity. That's, I think, what was so amazing about going to the moon. But we have 17 problems. They're all problems. We got the whole world focused on problems. There's more to the human spirit than solving problems. I mean, what are we solving problems for? What if we solved all 17 of the problems? Then what? Our spirit has nothing to do? So, in 2019, to part of the UN, I put together a set. I don't know if it was the right set. I wanted to put together a set of 17 things that I thought weren't solving problems. They would just be inspirational goals, things that humanity could just do that might be extraordinary, to inspire us. This was them. You may agree or disagree with a bunch of them. What I love is since doing this, the global internet, it was clear. Only 1/3 of the world had access to the internet. Everybody should have access to the internet. It doesn't solve a particular problem. It's clear we should all just have access to it. And now, Elon Musk, because he's creating 24,000 satellites in the world, he may do it. And actually, it'll just get solved by one dude. Global currency was another one. Does it make sense? Every time I fly, I have to buy the currency of the country that I'm in. I go to Dubai for a couple days, I gotta buy Dubai currency, and then some bank is sifting off of that every single time as I'm changing money. I mean, money is just money. And since then, I mean, now we have Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. We have global currency. And so there's this whole set. Modern governance, that's probably the one they didn't like. That didn't make it to the 17. The United States is probably one of the most modern governments. It was created 200 years ago. 200 years ago, the President of the United States, if he wanted to send a note to nearby Boston, Massachusetts, he would have to write a note. And he didn't know how to write because they didn't have ballpoint pens. They had fountain tip pens. It was a skill. He'd have to find a quillist to take his note down. And then he'd have to hand the note to a horseman, a man on a horse, who would then gallop to Boston. And it would take a month. And he often wouldn't make it, because on the way he would get married or find a job. And so the president would give it to 3 people. That was when we created our concept of governance. Well, maybe things have changed a bit, and we should relook at it. But that's the list. And you have to look at yourselves. Are you just solving problems in your life? Have you lost your human spirit, the control that your human spirit has over your mind and your body? Or are you just fixing the problems that the mind wants fixed? I have this friend, brilliant, Kunal knows him too. Every day, without exception, he jumps into his freezing tank of cold water he has. Several times he jumps. I remember him telling the story about it, because I couldn't understand it. I hate cold water. He says, I hate cold water too. I says, why do you do it? He says, well, my body hates cold water. Hates it. It's painful. It's not cold, it's painful. As I jump in the water, it's 38 degrees. Ice and everything. And my body hates it. And my mind remembers that it hates it. My mind hates it even worse than my body does. But I'm not run by my body or my mind. And so when my spirit tells my mind to jump, it better jump. And he jumps. And then he gets out. And he does it again. And he'll do it several times every day. So that his spirit is running his life. And he's trained his body and his mind to be run by his spirit and not the other way around. The other thing great leaders do is they don't create followers. We have a belief around the world that if you're a great leader, you have a lot of followers. Enlightened leaders know that everyone makes mistakes. And since everyone includes leaders, it means leaders make mistakes too. And if followers do what leaders say, then all the followers make mistakes too. And then the organization is not so strong. In fact, the organization fails on a single point of failure of one person. But the ego likes followers. And so sometimes the ego will create more and more followers. And we know that those organizations do not last anywhere near as well as the organizations where the leaders have a different concept, where the leader creates other leaders. And the greatest leaders create other leaders that know how to create other leaders. And so real leaders, they create leaders who can develop other leaders, which means that if even a single person has this concept and they enter an organization over time, the entire organization changes. This is not a skill. It's not something that a leader teaches to somebody else how to create more leaders. It actually doesn't work that way. It works by becoming a leader. And we become a leader by developing an extraordinary sense of character, not by learning skills and techniques. That's management. And so, as we work on character traits, as we become and develop our humility, or our integrity, or our temperance, or our courage, as we develop these character traits, then people don't just want to follow us, but they also want to become like us, which is a leader. And organizations that are filled with leaders are dynamic organizations that are not susceptible to single points of failure. And so they survive change. And in a future like ours, change will become the norm. Disruption becomes the norm. It used to be quite rare, but now change is the norm, which is why we keep seeing companies disappearing and falling off. 40%, 90% of the Fortune 500 from 1965 are not even on the list anymore. They were supposed to be the companies that lasted forever. 90% of them are gone. So here's the point. Exponential leaders, they don't try to change the world. They change themselves. And we know this from every leader that has been on the planet. Every successfully great leader. And the other thing we know is that they acted with extraordinary courage. They were like that buffalo that somehow had a crazy thought to charge a lion. I'm not saying do dumb things. I mean, there's a lot of dumb things that we can do in the world. I'm saying we can take calculated risks. And it's not even that kind of risk of the body. It's risk of the mind and the soul. The best picture I know of that is this one. It was only discovered 20 years ago. Adolf Hitler just spoke. It was illegal not to hail the Hitler. And I don't know if you can see this photo, but it's pretty clear that that guy is saying, I'm not doing it. I didn't draw that circle. The Nazis drew that circle around him to identify him. I didn't know who he was for 6 months after I had the photo. And then I met a woman in Denmark who actually knew who he was. And she tells me the story. And she says it's August Landmaster. And he joined the Nazi Party in 1931 for the hope it presented to a crushed Germany. But in 1934, he meets Irma Eckler in the photo, falls in love, gets engaged. But Irma's Jewish, part Jewish. So in 1935, he gets expelled, his marriage is denied. And that's when the photo is taken. In other words, August Landmaster gets the courage, unlike anyone else, to say, I'm not doing it because of his love and compassion for Irma. 1937, he flees to Denmark. He's caught at the border by the Nazis, which is how the Danes know who he was. 1938, he's acquitted. He's warned. Never do it again. He continues anyway. It's the love he has of Irma. He gets arrested again. He continues anyway. He's arrested a third time. And he says in the court, I love Irma. And I would never stop. So they send him to the war. 2 years of hard labor. It's believed that he dies in the war. Irma gets sent to Bamberg, where she's killed with 10,000 other Jews. Every act of courage does not go rewarded. Few are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rare commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change a world which lives most painfully to change. And if you think for a moment that you can't make a difference, you'd be wrong. Not out of theory, but actually out of science. Chaos theory says the butterfly effect, that something as small as the flutter of a butterfly's wing can ultimately cause a typhoon halfway around the world. And we know this is a fact because we actually model the typhoons from satellites that watch them. And we know that every single typhoon has come from some small, wispy little wind that just happened to catch the right other winds and build and build and build until it turns into a typhoon that hits the coast of India. Everything big comes from something small. Everything. Even great leaders. Every great leader was influenced by some small thing. It's like my hobby now, to trace it back for the leaders that we don't know about. Because I look at them and I think, I would not have the character traits that these extraordinary leaders have. They have extraordinary character traits. India filled with extraordinary gurus and leaders with extraordinary character traits. We'd be hard-pressed. But their journeys begin by very small acts, by very ordinary people. You look at Martin Luther King, you could trace it back, because he said it super clear, he said it multiple times. All of my works were inspired by one woman. One woman, because of where she chose to sit in a single day, in a single moment of her life, on a bus. Grasp this. One woman changed the world because of where she chose to sit on a bus. Each time a person stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And so the potential of a human being is revealed. How much potential does a baby have? Anyone? Unlimited. Anybody doubt it? How much potential do you have? I guarantee it, you have more potential than a baby. But as we go through our life, we come across little failures here and there, and then we interpret them with sometimes undesirable emotions, and then we build a set of walls around us as we progress. And then we start to believe these ridiculous walls that we've created for ourselves. Hypothetical walls. And we start to believe it. And we start to believe that our potential is highly limited, and then we just do that. Most people never leave the town that they were born in. Not because anyone stops them, not because they don't have the financial means or the freedom or the capability, they're just maybe not curious enough, but they never even leave the town. Or just 6 months to explore what it might be like to live somewhere else in the world. It's our mind, our own mind, not a physical outside limitation that caps the extraordinary, unlimited potential that every single one of us was born with. Because the truth is, and I spoke about it at the beginning, the greatest discovery in the last 20 to 30 years is that technology is exponential. It will exponentially advance. The future of humanity will not at all be linear. It will double in its price performance. Not just in one thing, in a whole set of categories. It will keep exploding, reversing entropy in the universe. But recognize this. Technology does that because we make it so. We're the exponential thing. Technology is exponential because it's a side effect of the extraordinary being that we are. It's just a side effect of us. We're the exponential thing. You, I, capped by these beliefs we have of our potential. And regardless of the exponential capability of ourselves, we're capped by emotions that we have that we don't want. Because every time something doesn't go quite right, every time we can't keep something that we think is ours, every time we think about the future and it's not yet the future, but we worry about it, or we regret something that we've done in the past, or we have a fear of the future, every time we believe or crave something that we're somehow not quite right because we don't have something, every time we divide and create divisions and then put things into the division and think that our division is right and the other one is wrong, things the ego does, that the mind does, we end up suffering. And that suffering is responsible for capping all of our potential. The decisions that leaders in the world make are made from suffering states. They're made from fear, anxiety, regret, revenge. Can you imagine a world where our leaders were enlightened, liberated from suffering? Suffering is not, it's not the external events. It's not the thing. You know this better than anyone. It's not the things that you're thinking about. The suffering is the process itself. It's not the thing that I'm worried about in the future. It's the fact that I keep thinking about it. I keep thinking about it. That is the suffering. And so when I can sit still and observe that, I'm liberated. I'm free. I realize that it's my mind recursively, obsessively thinking about myself. Being free from suffering is not limited to the Buddha or the Buddhist disciples or to man or to people in India. All of us can have it. It's not years and years of labor and work. It's a set of insights. And when you have them, you're free. Enlightenment is not enlightening experiences. Enlightening experiences, we get enlightening experiences. I had an enlightening experience today. We get those are momentary. And they're wonderful and they're inspiring. And I believe they turn us, as even I had 20 years ago, into seekers. But those are just enlightening experiences. Enlightenment is liberation from all forms of suffering. And it is within every person in this room's grasp. Not through years of effort, but probably through a couple months. But you have to get the right insights. And my belief is that India is the leader and the focus of this. And it represents an extraordinary opportunity, especially for this community. This community is truly exceptional. I visit all kinds of communities all around the world. I've never seen a community with so many enlightening experiences. I've never seen a community so impacted by enlightened people. The gateway to liberation from suffering is through your own mind. It's not something external. You know this better than me. It's not the external thing. Where does suffering happen? It happens here, inside of us. Which means the only cure to it is inside of us. We can do all 17 of the sustainable goals. We can solve them all. Everybody would have food, water, energy, healthcare, and the world would still be suffering. It won't solve loneliness. It won't solve fear. It won't solve anxiety, depression. We're trying to solve the wrong thing. I've been wrong my entire life, thinking that if I solve these problems, if we can create goals for the world to solve these external problems, that our suffering would end. And it's not true. We can end our suffering first. You can be happy, hungry. You can be happy without clean water. You can be happy without great health care. Yes, it's nice to have those things, but we can end the suffering. Can you imagine the world in the future where the leaders are making decisions from a state of calm and compassion and love? All of the other 17 problems would go away. Because an enlightened person, more so than anybody else, knows the insights. And one of the insights is that we're all connected. I'm not that separate from you. I have a body and I feel like I'm separate, but the things that I do will impact you. The things you do will impact me. In other words, an enlightened person is the least harmful being on the planet. Facing yourself, witnessing your thoughts, relaxing exercise. Through this observation, insights of wisdom get ignited. Through this wisdom, you can transform your victim mind to a victor mind, and suffering ends. I visited Varanasi 2019. Extraordinary experience. I imagine some of you here have done that. This is where we end up. I showed you all the exponential technologies, and we're greatly going to increase the average human age. In fact, we increase the average age of a human being. It was every 15 years. It keeps happening. In fact, now we just did it in 7 years. And we believe in 3.5 years we will reduce the average human age by a year again. And then in 1.75 years we'll reduce the average human age by a year again. And in 2029, it was predicted that we will reduce the average human age will be reduced by a year every year. Which means if you made it to 2029, you might actually live a very long time. The scientists, because of discoveries of CRISPR-Cas9, a bunch of technologies that have happened, have readjusted their estimate. They don't think it's 2029 anymore. They think it's 2030. Sorry, they thought it was 2039 before. Now they think it's 2029, which is only 9 years away. They think the average human age on the planet will increase by a year every year. Now, admittedly, that will probably happen in the povertiest regions first, but it'll keep happening. And so there's an extraordinary thing that might happen. But the truth is that that's probably what happens to us. And so I was curious. How do we get to the end of our life and look back and say that was extraordinary? Because that's different than happiness. We can be happy every day and then get to the end and not be satisfied with life. There's something different about fulfillment. Happiness is easy. It's fleeting. I buy a new car. I'm happy. Until somebody dents my car. And I wasn't happy. But fulfillment is different. This banker in New York, Bronnie Ware, a woman, she was curious too. And after 8 years being an investment banker, Australian, she quits. She quits her job and becomes a palliative care nurse, and she starts taking care of people that have just 2 or 3 years left to live. And she asks them repeatedly, what are the biggest regrets of your life? And she writes it down. And she creates a blog so other people can read it. And as she's creating the blog, she makes an insight. And the insight is that everybody has the same 5 regrets. And so now, some people actually took her blog and they wrote a book called Regrets of the Dying. Here are the insights. I wish I'd let myself be happier, laughed and stayed silly. I wished I had stayed in touch with my friends. I wish I had the courage to express my feelings, told people I love them. I wish I hadn't worked so hard on a treadmill of existence doing the same thing every day. But the number one regret by far for the people that were dying was that I wished I'd had the courage to not live the life others expected of me. Paul Graham, he runs an incubator in Silicon Valley, Y Combinator. The best incubator in the world. Still, pretty insightful quote for a guy who runs an incubator. He says, the 5 regrets painted portrait of a post-industrial person who shrinks into a shape that fits their circumstances and then turn dutifully till they stop. They become a cog. And cogs are not very valuable because they're easily replaced, and cogism is not much of a life. And there's only one way to end it. There's only one way to end cogism. You've got to do something courageous. If you have to, you run like hell, like that buffalo did. But you have to do something courageous with your life. And it's the only way to end your cogism and have a valuable life. And so then the only question remaining is, well, what if I'm not a courageous person? Where would I get the courage from? And what I've realized now, after having an opportunity to witness many people over the years win medals of courage, I've realized that never once did they do something courageous to win a medal of courage. In fact, never once did they even do something courageous to be courageous. It was always the same reason. I loved my fellow firemen. I loved my fellow policemen. I loved my family. I loved my community. I fell in love with the divine. You grow your sense of compassion, and the courage comes with it for free. I'll end with this. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else, like compassion, is more important than fear. The brave may not live forever, like August Landis, but the cautious do not live at all. Global impact begins with the courage to first change ourselves. Thank you.
How's everyone feeling out there? I know we've kept you, and thank you for staying with us, because I know time is precious, life in every breath. But I just hope you had an insight or two, or 200, like I do every time I hear David speak. It's like stepping into a river. Even if you step into the same river, it is never the same. It's just like our mantras, just like our traditions. We all learn from each other in this satsang. And with that, I would love to invite the extraordinary lady that made this possible for us. It truly has been the deepest divine honor for both David and myself to be graced by your presence, by your love, by your patience, and hopefully by your blessing. So with that, we invite Vijay to say a few words.
Thank you, David. I think it was, David, much longer than a normal talk, and yet I think everybody has stayed here, which means I think it really touched us. It really got us thinking, and I'm hearing it for the second time today. Yesterday I was in Chennai where we had some meetings, but Lalitji mentioned that there were these.
It works.
Yeah, it's working.
It works. Yeah.
Is it working?
Yes.
So I had this opportunity to hear yesterday, and I must say that there were newer examples of what was explained. So I think I benefited not only from yesterday's talk but from today's session as well. And I think, as he mentioned, I keep feeling that life, this is not something that's the privilege for a few. For I think everybody, it's not about somebody being very privileged and extraordinary. Life gives us ample opportunities, moments of truth to delve within and realize those insights. And I think it's our prerogative, privilege for each one of us to draw on these qualities that he spoke of. It's there within each one of us. It's just that we have to draw that from within. We have it and use that to express ourselves. And as was also mentioned, I think Auroville is a very unique example. It's not a society that's just thinking of subsistence or struggling, surviving, subsisting, thriving, but it's in a lot of ways we can say it's also somewhere tending towards prosperity in various dimensions. The way, and this was a lady in her late 90s, a supremely evolved soul who thought of this not from a mental level but something far beyond. You spoke of the evolution. She's given us this. And one of the things that strikes me is that she also drew the difference and tried to explain to us, which I think every day that one is here and trying to experience it, that a lot of times you try to solve or address problems that the world has by dealing with it on the outside. So the point that you made, she said that it's by working on the inside that the outside will get transformed. And I think we have to do that. There is no choice. And additionally, when you do mention that sometimes solving these problems of hunger, poverty, etc. for humanity, that you can be happy and poor. So we do sometimes have this problem of poverty of prosperity, and sometimes the reverse, the prosperity of poverty. But I think what the philosophy at Auroville that Sri Aurobindo has, through his direct action, also tried to explain to us is the synthesis. They're not two exclusive things. You can really embrace beauty, abundance, prosperity, compassion, and yet be in a state of higher consciousness and be a beacon for the rest of the world. So when you spoke of the, not only the 17 SDGs that we're all familiar with, but the new global, the inspirational goals, GIGS, as an acronym, Global Inspirational Goals. This is just a thought for all our sisters and brothers here. Would Auroville also like to look at some of these? We don't have to quite adopt these, we can adapt them, but can we do something beyond just problem solving, which would happen? It would be a spin-off, as you said, if we really raise ourselves, which is a part of the journey we're all in. But I think this is another new exercise, the 12 qualities, sourcing, oneness, and we have a festival which is starting. I want to really appreciate the amazing work that our leaders here, I think each one of the people here, they've all been contributing phenomenally, and the whole of Auroville, the kind of enterprise, the kind of commitment that you see, it's something remarkable. But we have to be beacons for the world, and I think this interaction, this session that we had today was indeed a treat. And I think it's not that there's something extraordinarily new that comes, but I think some of the most impactful things are those that are there within us. But sometimes you just need to have that resonance. It just rings a bell and again sort of shakes you up a little bit and makes each of us recalibrate, introspect, reflect, and figure out what are the moments of truth. What do I do with my life? So thank you again. Thank you, Lalitji, for a beautiful session. And I think this in a way has started the process of having more such interactions. And I think there are many beautiful minds in Auroville. So we also want to invite all of you to suggest Dev, Anu, and the team. Luca is also involved. They're trying to put together a series of talks because it's about sharing. I think sometimes what we have learned, our insights, the more we generously distribute them and share, we don't know. A little butterfly, as he says, the impact, we may not realize the impact of what we're saying or doing. But I think it is for others, like the compassionate Buddha. You could have gone off into a cave and he had that choice. But he said, no, I'm going to come back. And I think in little ways, with all our imperfections too, the fact that we're trying, the fact that we're aspiring is absolutely important. Once again, thank you. We are indeed privileged. I hope you had a good darshan at Matumandir. Please come again and be a part of our team at Auroville is my request. Is that all right with all of us?
Thank you.
Thank you.